Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks. Well, this is a very Tony reading series, and I'm just concerned I'm going to lower the level of discourse, but I will do it. And I want you to know that people everywhere certainly know what's going, in the literary world know what's going on here in Victoria, and it's really impressive what you all have done. It's really quite something. And so I've just been so curious. I'm really happy to be here. So now I'm going to read you something that I hope will be fun. This is from the newest book, Famous Writers I Have Known. So first I'll just give you the setup and we can talk about it afterwards. It's about a small-time con man on the run. He ends up teaching in a prestigious writing, passing himself off as one of the world's most reclusive writers, and he ends up teaching in a prestigious writing program somewhere in the heart of Texas. Okay, so what I'm going to read, you have to understand the whole point of this is that he knows absolutely nothing about writing, and he has to teach it. But he's a very clever guy, and it's about whether he's going to be able to pull this off or not. So I'm going to read you a section about what he thinks about his teaching. And for those of you who have taught or have ever been in a creative writing class, I'm sure that'll have some resonance. So how were my classes going? They were pretty dicey, to tell you the truth. With regular coaching from Wayne, now Wayne is the hapless director of the program who resembles me in a way. With regular coaching from Wayne, I was beginning to pick up some of the creative writing lingo, but there was no way I was going to get it all down in a few short weeks. I was flying by the seat of my pants. The students would all be jabbering away about the third person versus the third person versus the first person, and I'd be wondering, where did the second person go? Sometimes when they argued about some literary dispute, my mind would go into a cloud, like it used to when I was in New York and found myself in a subway car where everyone was speaking Cantonese. I'd been able to coast through September on the exercises Wayne had recommended, plus, of course, my own stories. Oh, the kids loved them, all my tales of the Korean grocer chasing us down Broadway with a broom, of our sneaking into movie theaters in Times Square, of how when you have a big snow in New York, the whole city would shut down and we'd take cookie sheets, cardboard boxes, whatever we could get our hands on, and go sledding in Riverside all day long. And then, of course, he's a great liar, too. So he says, they'd like to hear about when I got famous, too. About the time Brigitte Bardot showed up unannounced at my island in Maine to plead with me to join her in her crusade to save the world's endangered species. About Marlon Brando sending me the motorcycle jacket he wore in the Wild Ones for my 40th birthday. About the night I spent drinking with Little Richard and Ernest Hemingway. The problem was when their stories came in, because what they turned in weren't stories. Nothing happened in them. A divorced father buys a Christmas tree for his kids, and when he tries to decorate it, the lights won't work. A Mississippi tractor driver finds an Indian arrowhead while he's plowing, but it slips out of his overalls that night while he's playing the slots at the casino. A girl visits her father's grave in the North Woods, gets high, has a flat on her way back to her mama's place, but she doesn't have a jack. It sure wasn't Swiss Family Robinson. The pieces that weren't tear-jerkers were so clever they made your teeth hurt. Nick wrote this thing about Elijah's in the desert being fed by ravens when Elvis Presley shows up in a pink Cadillac, fresh from Vegas, stoned out of his mind on pills and speaking Aramaic. But if reading these suckers was tough, the class discussions were tougher. The rule seemed to be that when your story was being workshopped, you've got to sit there and not say a word, while everyone in the room goes around and says any damn thing about it that comes into his head. They had no end of suggestions. More of the mother, less of the mother. Turn the mother into an aunt. Change to the third person, use more subordinate clauses, raise the stakes, cut the backstory, fill us in on the narrator's history. Where they really went nuts, though, was when they caught someone using a cliché. Apparently, it was considered worse than murdering your children. I wasn't going to mention it, but for my money, these stories could have used a few more clichés. It's always darkest before the dawn, say, or it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. Something for you to hold on to. Mel had turned in 4 pages that read like the instructions you fish out of a prescription bottle. As far as my expressions went, as far as my responses went, I had worked up a couple of good genius expressions. The first was to put my finger to my temples and screw up my face like I was passing a world record turd, and then, without warning, sit bolt upright in my chair, bang my forehead with my fist, and shout, "I've got it!" The other was to get this faraway look in my eye and let my arm float slowly off the table and start making soft little sounds like a man in touch with the gods. I had learned a couple of important lessons. I couldn't get away with merely echoing what the students said, and giving my honest opinion wasn't the best idea. When I suggested it would be interesting if Latasha made her Mississippi tractor driver a woman instead of a man, she looked at me as if I'd been whacked a few too many times with the dumb stick. I learned to keep it cryptic. One of my favorite bits was to flip through a manuscript and randomly pick out a word. Look at page 7, I'd say, 3 lines down. You see the word ploddingly? You need to go home tonight and spend an hour meditating on exactly what that means. And I think the whole story will open up for you. They made it pretty clear to me from the start that they expected written comments. The idea scared me to death. What I decided to do was mark up the stories with different colored pens. I drew arrows and circled paragraphs, slashed Zorro-like Z's through long passages of dialogue. I added stars and checks of various sizes, tossing in a few question marks where there was room. By the time I finished, some of the pages looked like the freeway maps to downtown LA. Nick and Bryn were the first to get the marked up manuscripts turned back to them. Their eyes got big as pie tins. As they leafed their way through the technicolored pages, their faces got paler and paler. Bryn quietly slipped her story into her backpack, but Nick finally got up his nerve to say something. "I'm just curious," he said, his voice shaking, "about these marks." "Oh, you don't need to worry about that," I said. "Those are just my reading notes to myself." My ace in the hole was just how in awe of me they were. Because remember, he's this Salinger-like figure to them. It was nice that they would leave little gifts outside my office, a bottle of fine scotch, a hand-picked bouquet, a couple of peyote buttons in a hand-carved Mexican box, a slender volume of short stories by some glum-looking loser you'd never heard of. But what really made it great was the hush when I walked into the room. I turned out to be so much wittier than I thought I was. My most casual remarks turned out to have hidden depths. I had a dog once when I was a kid, and he didn't look at me with half the admiration that these kids did. Plus, I had to feed the dog. I had an aura, and sometimes it felt as if I was just getting my due. The kids were shy around me. It was a couple of weeks after, Rex is this Michener-like figure who was endowed with money. Rex and Ramona and I had gotten back from our trip to the coast that Nick finally got up the nerve to ask the question they all were dying to ask. "So why did you quit writing?" The room got quiet real fast. Dominique glared at him, and Latasha looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. Everyone knew what he was asking. He wanted to know about my feud with Michener, that's the Michener character, but damned if I was going to go near that one. No, that's all right. I pressed my palms together in front of my lips, considering what to do. I could have just refused to answer. But there's one thing that people don't understand about con artists. The key to getting people to show confidence in you is for you to show confidence in them. I got up from the table and went to close the door. They all stared at me like a nest of young owls. "So why did I quit writing?" I can trust you not to repeat this to anyone? Around the table, they're all nodding and mumbling. I scrutinized them for 3 or 4 seconds, and then went to the window and gazed out at the parking lot, brooding. I rubbed my hair and finally turned back to them. "I suppose, my friends, I quit writing because I got tired of feeling like I was a fraud. And this is his, after Eat Your Wheaties, that's his big hit. You know. After Eat Your Wheaties came out, my life turned into a three-ring circus. Everyone wanted a piece of me. I was getting invitations to the Easter egg roll on the White House lawn. Sinatra called me to see if he could get me to cut an album with him. I didn't tell you that, I thought I did. And then I got myself caught up in some real messes. It was madness. I started drinking, I started doing a little drugs. Now, how were they taking all this? It was hard to tell, except for Latasha, who was sneaking me sympathetic little smiles. Nobody would look at me. They all seemed a little stricken and embarrassed. Mercedes had her head bowed as if she might be praying. Mel kept gritting his teeth, and every so often he'd surreptitiously thumb through copies of his story, checking on the comments the others had made on his manuscript. There was no time to write, and even when there was time, I couldn't focus. I'd work on a single page for hours, and at the end of the day, I'd look at it and realize it was nothing but an imitation of something I'd done 5 years before. I was turning into a caricature of myself. I'd wake up in the morning, look in the mirror, and think, who is that guy? That's why I moved to Maine and cut myself off from everyone. I was trying to get in touch with that still inner voice. Brett shot me this quick sidelong glance. That bit about the still inner voice, by the way, it's not original with me. I read about it in one of those inspirational creative writing manuals that Wayne had lent me. God knows I've tried. For years I've tortured myself. I must have started a dozen books and ended up throwing them all in the fireplace. Mercedes looked up for the first time, her eyes brimming with tears. I suppose I've made my peace with that. The way I've come to understand it, when it happens like it happened with Eat Your Wheaties, you're just the instrument. It's like there's a wind blowing through you. Again, that's from the manual. I can't recommend it too highly. If I remember right, the author is from some teacher's college in Missouri, and the title is The Wings of Prometheus. But how are we supposed to make ourselves the instrument of something, Bryn said. You can begin by listening to your heart, I said. There are a few things I do know. Writing is not about cleverness. It's not about proving how smart you are. You're not going to be able to fake your way through this. For openers, I'd say, start telling the truth. So thank you. Now, I have a lot to say or talk about this, but I thought we might just begin the next little portion of the session by seeing if you had questions, and I might get going. Anybody have any thoughts, questions about this?
When does the movie come out?
Oh, I know. People keep saying that. Oh, people do keep saying that. All my life. People have been promising. That's where I learned about con men in Hollywood, but really, yeah. Maybe I'll talk a little about where the book came from. I had come to teach at the University of Texas when James Michener first moved there, and he had talked about starting a writing program that eventually became the Michener Center for Writers. But as he was dying, all these people all the buzzards were circling, waiting to get the last 5 million, 10 million out of him. And I attended a lot of those lunches. And it was sort of horrifying and totally fascinating to me. But I also knew that in his past, there was this sort of dark period of his life. There were these two children. He had his last marriage was good. The first two were not so great. In the second, he tried to save the marriage. He had, they had adopted two children that the marriage blew up. They went to the wife, and then the wife gave them back. Anyway, he lost touch with it. It was sort of the dark period of it. I kept thinking, what a great book this would be if the real son came back, in the middle of all these people who are feuding over the last of the money. It's not quite in the book where it ended up, but that got me started. The other thing, which you had mentioned, is that every spring I go to the airport, or every spring and fall, to pick up some writer to come teach who I've probably never met, right? And all I have is some old author photo on the back of the cover. And I'm looking for somebody who looks like they're looking for somebody. And I thought, what if I got the wrong guy? It's sort of been this nightmare for me. So here are these two radical ideas that I ended up in a way, putting together. I kept thinking these can't fit in the same book, but I kept, you keep jockeying and playing, and eventually I figured out a way to do all of this. And in a way, it's interesting. A lot of my books, I did a lot of research for them. But when I had kids, I'm living in Austin. I had to figure out a way to write books where I didn't have to travel so much. And I did a couple, but this one I was able to fuse two parts of my life, my 20 years in Texas and 20 years in New York, because he's an old New York guy. And so I was able to use a lot of this sort of street stuff from New York plus Texas, and then the Michener character who is in the book. I'll give you one other little storyline. In the book, there's a writer who has written 50 books, huge bestsellers, the best-selling author of all time, but he gets no literary respect. Then there's another writer who wrote one book and never wrote again, disappeared in Maine, and he is like an idol. Everyone's like, who is this guy, this great genius? And there's a feud between the two of them. So then, of course, our guy, Frankie, ends up posing as that writer, and then it sets off things between the two of them. So that's part of it. So I'm going to give this another shot about questions that you might have. Yeah, please.
I'm going to ask 2 questions.
Please.
I was at UT during that time.
Oh, yes,
Do you remember Even Carlton or Maxine Harrison?
I sure do.
I thought
She
was expository writing.
Oh, she was great. She was a spectacular teacher.
But Michener, and I had the pleasure of meeting him.
Yeah.
What a joy.
Yeah.
Were you instrumental in getting him to let his school be at UT?
Well, I don't know that it's instrumental, but I wasn't a jerk. I think that was my basic, thing, I think when he decided, he said, that Magnuson, he's honest as milk. I think that's what he said. Is I wasn't because money changes people's relationship to everybody, and a lot of people went away mad when they were trying to figure out who might run this. A lot of people, they'd go mad immediately. I can't pay him $5,000 to start this little magazine in the summer. I quit. So people were quitting like crazy. They were all wound up, and I'm like, here's another great story. I had been out in Los Angeles. I was working for oh my gosh, I'm so ashamed, but I have to, for the sake of honesty. I was working for Knots Landing, and so I came back, and they said they wanted me to take this job, and I thought, I am the world's least likely administrator. This is not. And so they offered me the job, and I said, listen, you guys, you can't afford me. I'm earning Hollywood money now. Little did I know I would never be offered another, but they didn't know that. And I kept saying, no, I don't want it. I don't want it. And if I'd been bluffing, it would have been the best thing. I wasn't bluffing, but they kept coming back. So I took this job, and it's been great. I've done it for 22 years. I think the key thing is to be, about running things, to somehow, you have to know how to soothe people and how to handle people. And some of it, but there have been so many wonderful young writers. Oh, and here's the other thing. The nice thing is, because of his endowment, we've been able to give these wonderful fellowships to be able to get really good people. And this is in the book, but it turned out to be true, that in the end, in the book, it says, all of the students that have been taught so horribly by this guy end up being great successes. But he says, in the beginning, everybody wanted to know about the Scheninger figure, the Michener figure. Now it's the students they ask about. And now that's actually true, really, because the students, it's in a generation has passed, really. And for some of us, older people, really do remember Michener, but this younger generation really doesn't. But all these students that he's supported, this is his vision. They, Philip Meyer wrote a book called The Sun, some of you may know, or there was a kid, Karan Mahajan, who just was a finalist for the National Book Award, that. So, people are nodding because they know, and was his legacy. That was his kind of, he had a vision of what he wanted, and this sounds too small, but it's really been my honor to try to help fulfill that over that time. You know, you get invested in it. That's why I wrote the book. I thought, this is a little risky. You can look like biting a hand that feeds you and stuff. But I thought, nobody knows this story but me. And I really knew him in the last 10 years of his life, and I knew what was going on. So it all ended up. He reminded me a little of my father. He was very generous, but he was the tightest guy you ever saw. He would not want to be his plumber trying to collect your bill. But he would give millions of dollars if he thought something was worthy. And he was one of those guys. Not too many of those, but yes, please.
What's it like writing the character of a writer?
Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? Well, I feel like I've lived around. It's a world I know so well. Both, you know, looking at my students, been around them for 50 years, and I know how neurotic they are. And I suppose somebody said, "So are you Frankie, the con man?" Of course, I deny it, but there's something in there, you know. There is something. This is not answering your question, but it's a little thing. I went to the LA Book Festival, and several of my students were there, and we went out to dinner afterwards. And I was a little nervous, like how they felt. They were, you know, the students are being portrayed, and sometimes they look like idiots. And when they're like, "Gee, how did you take that?" And this young woman, a very nice woman, she said, "Oh, I cried at the end." I said, "Oh, why did you cry?" It's because, no, I'm giving something away, but Frankie's back in prison. He doesn't pull this off. Frankie's back in prison, but at the end, there's like one student that hasn't become a grand success, and that student is still sending Frankie manuscripts in prison, and he's still, so he's actually been won over. You know, he's actually been he's become one of us. After faking being a writer, he's actually become one, you know? And he's written this book. Oh gosh, yeah. Anybody else? I'd be happy to, anything you might have. Okay, so the other stories I thought, yeah.
I'm listening to you. And
sure.
Your mind is jumping around a lot.
It is.
And which, oh look, a bird. No.
Right.
How do you get from that place to writing something? Because that requires a discipline that's entirely different than like what you're exhibiting here.
Oh.
Like two different people?
No.
I didn't mean to insult you.
It's kind of good though. No, actually.
But I did, didn't I?
No. Here's what it is. You know what? I'm kind of freewheeling now, but if you sit down for 5 hours every day, and you do that, some of that you're free associating, or you have an idea and something else occurs to you, whatever. But you stay right there, and the act of writing, of trying to figure out how to make a good sentence and then a good paragraph that has a snap to it, and you do that for 50 years, and it gets into focus. I mean, the ideas for this, it took years to pull together, but working on daily. It's daily work, and revising from the beginning several times. So in one sense, it's different. And there's always a difference between the books and the public presentation. One little small example is Colm Toybeen, who's a wonderful writer who wrote the Master about Henry James, and he did Brooklyn. You know, they made the movie. He's a wonderful writer. In person, he is the funniest human being in the world. But there was no humor in those. The books are melancholy, beautiful, beautifully observed, but it is in a sense a separate personality. And also, I'm not really the guy who wrote this anyway. You know?
All right.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
That's fairly good, I guess. Okay, good.
One other thing about Michener, one thing he said is, the way you get there is to sit your pants down on that chair, and you work from 7 to 12 every day.
You really work, yeah.
Whether you had anything to say or not, you were in that
Yeah,
chair.
yeah. And once just making sentences starts making it better. Like I have no sensible thought till I write a couple sentences.
I mean,
Yeah.
you know, this is your livelihood.
Yeah. I also said to a group last night, I said, writing a novel, which usually takes me several years, you know, you're an idiot for 2.5 years, and then a genius for 6 months. And then you think you're going to hold on to that. The next one's going to be so easy. And no, you're back to being a total idiot again. You know? It's just work. It is work. Anybody? Yes, sir.
What's the thought process for you or somebody like Michener that would, select a subject to write on?
Well, now that is interesting, because Michener, I'm sure, is different than there are two different cases, and I think it's different for every writer. But with Michener, there actually was a great cartoon I saw in the New Yorker. In the picture of the ocean, this little dot in the middle, and said, "The only place James Michener hasn't written about." But in a sense, he was so curious, and it did seem schematic. He wanted to cover the world, all these a lot of the great subjects. He never wrote about South America. That's interesting to me.
Oh, no, it's Mexico.
He wrote about Mexico, and he was in the beginning. He was very. He came out of the South Pacific, and a lot of things he wrote about Asia. He was sort of their man in Asia. For me, I have a lot of ideas. I put them in a notebook, and because it takes it's so easy to have an idea, and it takes so long to write a book. These ideas end up being backed up like railroad cars on a side rail or something. That you want to. And now I'm more interested in. For me, I wrote several very tense. In the first book, would be considered totally literary. Then I discovered I had a certain talent for creating a certain narrative tension, and those other books are closer to literary thrillers of some kind or whatever. And then I thought, enough of this. I wanted to do. There's a tone that I had in the plays that I did in New York when I was young. They were just ridiculous. They were very funny, and I wanted to get. I would do things like a play about David and Goliath from Goliath's point of view. I did a play about a seeing eye dog with an eye for women, a 3-character play. I did. They were so off the wall, and I wanted to get that kind of madness and antic tone back, and then this ended up being perfect. The key with this book for me was I didn't want to make him too smart or too knowing. I wanted to make sure that I didn't want my literary ideas to sneak in there. So I kept every 3-syllable word, cross it out. Every beautiful piece of a literary description of Big Ben, cut it out. He didn't know the names of these trees or the beautiful red berries or whatever. That's not who he is. And so it is discipline. It is discipline. So for me now, I'm much more interested in doing something brand new. I think Michener there was almost a sense of him following a plan. And
He's never given his due.
yeah.
You know what I'm
Except by his readers, there were millions of people who loved his. Yeah.
But what did he lack? Was he not highbrow enough?
Well, let me say about this. I think that first book is wonderful, the Tales of the South Pacific. I think some of the later books, the prose style is not grand. He was he was so smart, and he was so curious, and he turned out these huge books on schedule, 2.5 years. So I wouldn't say they were, in a sense, they weren't Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, where every paragraph is poetry. That wasn't what he did. He loved poetry, but it was something different. But he did get, and he was, the other thing about him, he was a great citizen of the world.
Yes.
He did, honestly, he would call up a Polish novelist that he thought was important, and he would say, "I want to fund your writing of your next 4 books." He would do it. He did it for some poetry magazines. He just called them up out of the blue. Say, "Okay, for the rest of your, so long as you go, I'm funding this poetry series." That's the way he was, Certain kind of American optimist, came out of the Depression. So, and the other thing is, his legacy lives on in these new writers, who every spring they thank him. It's very personal, and that's a lot of stuff. So who knows who's going to carry these little flames into the future, right? You don't know. So yes, please.
Well, I see the Michener character, but con man, it seems like he has a little bit of like Hunter S. Thompson
well, yeah, maybe so. Yeah. Well, he's a little antic. He's not a. You come to see he does have a good heart in a way, but not. He's very, he's a total rascal. I mean, you learn about how he rips people off and the pleasure he takes in it. But he's conflicted a little bit eventually. Eventually, he gets conflicted about it. And he tries to get Michener's money. This guy, that's what he's really after. Fails miserably at it, but yeah, you guys have been great.